What if the man everyone ignored turned out to be the storm they never saw coming? When Eli Mercer quietly steps into a sleepy Mississippi town, he carries more than just a weathered suitcase. He carries secrets powerful enough to bring an entire system crashing down. Stay with us, because this isn't just a story about one man's silence. It's about the moment that silence shatters and the reckoning that follows. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here.
Remember
now,
to be strong.
Let's get into the story. Eli Mercer stepped off the creaky bus in the fading light of a late summer evening.
To be strong.
The small town of Ashridge, Mississippi, was already folding itself into quiet. Its shops shuttered its sidewalks, empty its air heavy with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Eli's steps were slow, almost measured, as if each footfall had been preordained to land exactly where it did. He wore a simple navy windbreaker khaki trousers, creased from the suitcase he carried, and a faded baseball cap that shadowed his eyes. No one on the bus had paid him much mind, and no one waiting at the terminal gave him more than a passing glance. That was how Eli preferred it. He moved like a man used to being overlooked, someone who knew the weight of silence and the power of keeping to himself. But silence wasn't always a shield. Sometimes it was a mask, and behind it there could be a storm waiting to break. Eli's dark skin was lined with age, his face a map of quiet resolve and unspoken battles. His back was straight, his shoulders broad, but his gait had a subtle limp, the kind that told stories if anyone had cared enough to ask. No one did. As he approached the weathered brick facade of the Ashridge Police Department, the fluorescent glow above the entrance buzzed louder than the cicadas in the trees. A pair of young officers stood by the door, laughing quietly to themselves, their uniforms crisp, their holsters full. They barely noticed Eli as he stepped closer, as if he were part of the backdrop. One of them, a tall blonde with a smirk too big for his face, glanced up and nodded toward him. "Evening, sir," he said with mock politeness, already turning back to his partner, before Eli could reply. Eli's voice was quiet but steady. "Evening," he said, and his eyes, sharp and unflinching, met the officer's for a fleeting second. Something in that glance should have warned them, but it didn't. Inside the station, the desk sergeant, an older man with thinning hair and a perpetual scowl, barely glanced up from his paperwork. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice flat and dismissive. Eli laid a small creased envelope on the counter. "I'd like to speak with Officer Chambers." The sergeant grunted, flipped through a battered logbook, and finally sighed. "Chambers is out on patrol. You'll have to wait." Eli nodded, stepped back, and sat quietly in one of the hard plastic chairs lining the wall. Minutes passed. Then 15. Then 30. The officers came and went, occasionally glancing at the quiet stranger in the waiting area, but never engaging, never questioning. They didn't notice the way he sat so still, the way his hands rested lightly on his knees, the way his gaze never wavered. They didn't see the quiet patience that hummed in his bones. Then the front doors swung open, and Officer Chambers strode in, laughing at something one of the patrolmen had said outside. He was a broad-shouldered man with a quick temper and a reputation for talking first and thinking later. His eyes skimmed the room, pausing on Eli. The laughter faded. "You here to file a report, old-timer?" he asked, voice thick with derision. Eli stood slow and deliberate. He stepped forward and placed a second, larger envelope on the counter. "I believe you'll want to take a look at this." Chambers scoffed. "What's this, your grocery list?" Eli's hand remained steady. "It's my credentials." Chambers grabbed the envelope with exaggerated carelessness, opened it, and scanned the contents. The color drained from his face. His shoulders tensed, and he looked up, really seeing Eli for the first time. But it was too late. Before he could speak, a low hum of engines and the crunch of tires on gravel filled the air. Outside, a convoy of black SUVs rolled up to the station, sleek, silent, unmistakable. The front door opened, and two men in dark suits stepped inside, their expressions unreadable, but their presence palpable. The younger officer by the door, the one who had smirked at Eli earlier, gawked. "Who the hell are you?" he whispered. Eli's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "You'll find out soon enough," he said softly. The suits approached Chambers, their voices low but firm, their identification flashing briefly in the dim light. "FBI, Internal Affairs, here for a very specific reason." The station's air thickened, the casual laughter vanished, and the officers suddenly stood straighter, their hands uncertain, their faces pale. In the center of it all, Eli Mercer stood calm and silent, as if he'd known this would happen all along. The truth was he had. Eli had come not just to observe, but to act, to hold a mirror to a system that believed itself untouchable. And as the realization rippled through the room, as the men in suits began their quiet, relentless work, Eli's presence became a weight no one could ignore. The quiet stranger had become the storm, and Ashridge, Mississippi, was about to learn that silence was never weakness. It was the quiet before the reckoning. The moment the FBI agent set foot in the station, the air thickened with a charge no one dared to name. Eli Mercer remained where he was, his hands still at his sides, while the younger officers who had mocked him only minutes before stiffened in their posts. Officer Chambers, pale and visibly rattled, fumbled with the envelope of credentials Eli had handed him. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. It was a strange kind of silence, one pregnant with recognition, with the sudden understanding that something irreversible had begun. The taller of the two agents, a man in his late 40s, with steel-gray eyes, and the kind of posture that could still a room, addressed Chambers directly. "Officer Chambers, we need to speak with you in private. Now." His voice was calm, but brooked no resistance. Chambers' gaze flicked from the agents to Eli, then back again. He swallowed hard. Of course, he mumbled hastily, gesturing toward the back office. He moved like a man whose balance had been yanked from under him, like someone realizing he'd miscalculated the weight of a moment. The younger officers glanced at each other, uncertain whether to follow, to stay put, or to somehow vanish. The second agent, a woman with a sharp bob and a quiet authority, turned to Eli and gave a subtle nod of respect. "Mr. Mercer," she said softly, "we'll handle it from here." Eli's eyes, calm but clear, met hers. "I know you will," he replied. His voice carried no triumph, no trace of ego, just the weight of someone who'd witnessed systems crumble before and understood how these things unfolded. As Chambers disappeared into the office, the younger officers shifted uncomfortably. One of them, the same blonde who'd first greeted Eli with mock politeness, finally found his voice. Sir, we didn't know. Eli held up a hand, stopping him without a word. His eyes softened, but there was steel beneath the kindness. You didn't ask, he said simply. The words weren't harsh, but they landed with a finality that made the younger officer's face flush. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder now. The front doors remained ajar. The convoy of SUVs outside, waiting like silent witnesses. It wasn't a raid, not the kind of spectacle that made headlines. It was something more deliberate, more surgical. And in the quiet weight of that realization, the officers at the station began to feel the floor beneath them shift. In the back office behind a closed door, voices rose and fell in sharp, urgent murmurs. Chambers was trying to explain, to justify, to cover the gaps left by his arrogance. But explanations didn't matter now. The agents weren't here to listen to excuses. They were here for the truth, and Eli had brought them to the doorstep of it. Outside, a young woman entered the station, her heels clicking nervously against the tile. She wore a simple blouse and skirt, her ID badge pinned to her collar. An internal affairs coordinator named Grace Howard, sent from the local bureau office. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on Eli. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of this moment. She approached him quietly. "Mr. Mercer?" She said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "I'm so sorry this happened. We're here to make sure it doesn't happen again." Eli gave a faint nod. "That's not for me," he said quietly. "That's for every person they thought wouldn't speak up." Grace's jaw tightened, and she inclined her head. "I understand." They stood there for a moment, silent, but resolute. Around them, the station felt smaller, as though the walls themselves were folding inward. The younger officers tried to busy themselves with paperwork, but their eyes kept darting toward Eli and the agents toward the door of the back office, where their superior was being confronted by forces far beyond his rank. Finally, the door opened, and Chambers emerged, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. Behind him, the agents followed, their expressions unreadable, but their posture speaking volumes. The taller agent addressed the room. "As of this moment, Officer Chambers is placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. An official inquiry has been launched into this department's handling of recent incidents." A stunned silence followed. The officers behind the desk froze their pens, hovering over forms they could no longer focus on. One of them, a woman with a pixie cut and a look of quiet dismay, stood a little straighter, as if she'd been waiting for someone to finally say what needed to be said. Eli didn't move. He didn't need to. The words spoken in that room were the echoes of his quiet arrival, the manifestation of a truth that had hovered unspoken over Ashridge for too long. The agents turned to him, their nods almost imperceptible, but heavy with acknowledgement. Grace stepped forward again. "Would you like to make a statement, Mr. Mercer?" Eli's gaze swept the room, resting momentarily on each officer, on Chambers' defeated figure, on the young men and women who'd frozen at the sight of authority they'd failed to recognize. His voice was quiet, but resonant. "No," he said. "Not yet." Then, with the same steady grace that had carried him into the station, Eli picked up his envelope from the counter, tucked it under his arm, and walked toward the exit. He passed the young blonde officer who had mocked him earlier, pausing just long enough to hold the man's gaze. "Next time," Eli said softly, "look deeper before you speak." Outside, the air was cooler, the sky a deepening blue as dusk settled over Ashridge. The black SUVs were still waiting, their engines idling in quiet anticipation. Eli stepped off the sidewalk, his stride unhurried but purposeful. The agents followed a step behind Grace, catching up to his side. "What happens now?" she asked. Eli didn't stop walking. "Now," he said, "we make sure they never forget." And as he disappeared into the waiting convoy, the officers in the station finally understood the weight of the man they had dismissed. The turning point had arrived not with shouts or handcuffs, but with quiet, deliberate truth. And Ashridge, Mississippi would never be the same again. As the black SUVs merged into the slow lanes of Ashridge's narrow streets, the weight of what had just unfolded at the police station trailed behind them like a thick cloud. Eli Mercer sat in the back seat, his gaze fixed on the rows of tired brick buildings, the sagging telephone wires, the fading murals painted decades ago in a different world. He had seen this town's underbelly not just tonight, but for years, a place where assumptions were currency and silence was the law. But now that silence had been cracked and something had been set in motion that couldn't be stopped. Grace Howard, seated beside him, shifted in her seat, her phone buzzing with messages from the regional office. She glanced at Eli, hesitated, then finally asked, "You think it's enough? What we did back there?" Eli turned his head slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting not quite a smile, but something close. "It's not about enough," he said softly. "It's about making sure the truth stops being whispered and starts being spoken aloud." Their vehicle turned into the lot of a quiet building, a local community hall that from the outside looked no different from any other small-town venue. But tonight, it was different. A low hum of voices buzzed from within. Word had traveled fast, faster than anyone could have anticipated. As Eli stepped out, accompanied by Grace and the two agents, he noticed familiar faces, neighbor shop owners, a few retired servicemen who had known him in passing, but never suspected the depths of his story. Inside the hall wasn't packed, but the air was thick with expectation. People were seated in folding chairs, many glancing around, uncertainly murmuring in low voices. At the front, a makeshift podium had been set up. A middle-aged woman, Marlene, one of the community organizers who had quietly supported the old veterans over the years, stepped forward, tapping the microphone. "Everyone," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but gathering strength, "thank you for coming on such short notice. We didn't expect a gathering, but it seems news travels, and people have questions." Eli, still standing near the entrance, was content to let her speak. He wasn't here for drama or applause. But then Marlene's voice cracked slightly as she continued. "Most of you know Eli Mercer as the quiet man who's been part of this community longer than most of us. What you didn't know is he's been working for the FBI's Internal Affairs Division for years. What happened at the station today wasn't just an incident. It was the unveiling of a truth we've all been ignoring." The room rippled with gasps and murmurs. Eli finally stepped forward, his presence drawing a respectful silence. He approached the podium slowly, every movement deliberate, measured. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone." Eli began his voice, low, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I didn't walk into that station today expecting to make headlines, but I did expect to be treated like a human being. What happened wasn't new, not to me, and not to many of you. It's happened in quiet corners of this town, in small interactions that don't make the news, in whispers exchanged behind closed doors. But today, those whispers got louder." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, landing on faces, some guilty, some ashamed, some wide-eyed, with realization. I carry a badge, not because it makes me more important, but because it gives me the authority to confront the lies we tell ourselves. The lies that say respect is earned based on appearances, that dignity is conditional, that justice bends for those who know how to ask. That's not the truth. And today, that truth stood up. Marlene, standing to the side, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Grace by the wall watched with quiet admiration. The agents stood like sentinels, their presence a reminder that this wasn't just a local matter anymore. Eli continued his tone, never rising, but each word landing with the weight of conviction. You all know someone who's been dismissed, overlooked, treated like they didn't matter. You might be that person. You might be the one who stayed silent, thinking it wasn't your place to speak. But silence lets the rot grow. It lets good men believe they're powerless, and it lets bad men believe they're invincible. A young man from the audience, maybe in his 20s, stood hesitantly. His voice wavered. "Mr. Mercer, what can we do? What happens next?" Eli nodded, acknowledging the question. "What happens next is up to all of you," he said. "You stop pretending you don't see. You stop thinking it's someone else's problem. You call out the disrespect when you see it, not just in uniform, but anywhere. And when you think you're powerless, remember this day. Remember that it took one quiet man standing in silence to show everyone in that station, and now in this room, that truth doesn't come from shouting. It comes from standing your ground." The room fell into a hush so deep, even the creak of the old floorboards was loud. Grace stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Eli's arm. "It's time," she whispered. Eli nodded once. "This isn't the end," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. "It's just the beginning of the unveiling." He stepped back from the podium, the agents flanking him once again. As they moved toward the exit, a quiet ripple of applause began, tentative at first, then growing stronger. It wasn't a roar of approval. It was something better. It was recognition, respect, and perhaps for the first time in Ashridge's memory, hope. Outside, the cool night air felt lighter, the weight of silence finally beginning to lift. Grace glanced at Eli. They'll talk about tonight for a long time. "They'd better," Eli replied, his voice quiet but unshaken, "or we'll be back." And with that, they walked into the darkness, leaving behind not just a room of changed minds, but the start of a story that would echo far beyond the walls of that humble hall. The following morning in Ashridge dawned with a peculiar quietness. The streets, usually buzzing with the mundane hustle of small-town life, seemed to hold their breath as if waiting for something inevitable. At the Ashridge police station, the atmosphere was tense, thick with the unease of impending confrontation. Officers whispered in corners, their glances sharp with suspicion and uncertainty. Rumors had already begun to swirl about Eli Mercer, about the agents, about what it all might mean. Inside the station, Chief Walter Grady sat in his cramped office, the blinds drawn shut against the rising sun. His hands were steepled under his chin, jaw-clenched tight eyes fixed on the reports scattered across his desk. Reports he hadn't expected to read. Eli Mercer, FBI, Internal Affairs. It wasn't just a name on a badge anymore. It was a reckoning. A knock at the door startled him. Before he could respond, Grace Howard stepped inside, her expression unreadable. She was followed by two other agents, their demeanor calm, professional, but carrying an unmistakable authority that made even the most hardened officers step back. "Chief Grady," Grace said evenly, "we need to talk." Walter exhaled slowly, gesturing to the chairs across from his desk. "I suppose you're here about the incident." Grace didn't sit. Neither did the agents. "We're here about a pattern," she said. "A pattern of misconduct, of oversight failures, and of a culture that dismisses accountability." The words hung in the air like a gavel hitting wood. Walter shifted in his seat, the weight of her statement pressing down on him. "Look, this isn't how we do things here. There's been some misunderstandings, sure, but we've always handled them internally." Grace's voice didn't rise, but the steel in it sharpened. That's the problem. Handling things internally has allowed patterns of abuse and negligence to thrive unchecked. Eli Mercer wasn't just here by coincidence. He was here because there have been too many reports, too many dismissed complaints, too many silences. Walter's shoulders slumped, but his pride clung to the last vestiges of defense. "We've had our hands full, limited resources, understaffed. You know how it is." "That's not an excuse," Grace said firmly. "And you know it? What's coming isn't just a review, it's a full investigation. Effective immediately, this station is under federal oversight. Your department will be audited, your protocols scrutinized, and anyone found complicit will face consequences." The chief's face paled. "This is a disaster," he muttered, but his words lacked conviction. "This is accountability," Grace corrected, her voice low. "And it's overdue." Before Walter could respond, the front desk radio crackled, and an officer's voice came through thick with nervous tension. "Chief, we've got visitors, black SUVs. They're pulling into the lot now." Walter's heart sank. He didn't need to look outside to know who it was. More agents, more eyes, the weight of the truth pressing down on the station. Out front, Eli Mercer stepped out of one of the vehicles, accompanied by 2 senior field agents from Washington, D.C. He didn't stride with arrogance or self-importance. He walked with the same measured calm he had shown the night before, his presence more commanding for its quiet confidence. Inside the station, officers stood aside, their conversations dying mid-sentence as Eli entered. Some averted their eyes. Others watched with barely disguised fear. Eli didn't speak until he reached Grace and Chief Grady's office. "Walter," Eli said softly, addressing the chief by name, not title. "We both know why I'm here. This isn't personal. It's about what's right." Walter's lips tightened, but he said nothing. Eli continued, his tone as steady as his gaze. "I'm placing you on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. Internal Affairs will be reviewing every complaint filed against this department for the past 10 years. We're also implementing an immediate halt on all non-emergency field operations until further notice. You can cooperate or you can resist, but either way, this ends today." The chief sank back in his chair, the fight gone from his posture. "I never meant for it to get this far," he murmured, almost to himself. "That's the point," Eli replied. "It got this far because too many people looked the other way. It got this far because the silence was easier than the truth." In the corner, an officer, a young woman with a tentative voice, stepped forward. "Agent Mercer." She said, her words trembling. "What about us? The ones who didn't know or couldn't speak up?" Eli turned to her, his expression softening. "This isn't about punishing everyone," he said. "It's about giving everyone a choice. You can stay part of the problem, or you can be part of the change. That choice is yours." Grace nodded in agreement. "We'll be conducting interviews. Those who step forward, who choose to tell the truth, will be protected. But the ones who continue to hide will be held accountable." A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of a file folder dropping onto the desk. Eli placed it there deliberately. This is a list of names, dates, incidents. It's not just about what happened to me. It's about what's been happening to this community for years. Walter's gaze flicked to the folder, then back to Eli. His face was pale, but his voice, when it finally came, was low and resigned. "You'll get what you need." Eli inclined his head, the smallest gesture of acknowledgement. That's all anyone's ever asked for. As the agents moved to begin their review, Eli stepped out of the office back into the main hall of the station. The murmurs of the officers grew louder now, not with defiance, but with questions, with the first flickers of realization that the silence had been broken and the reckoning had begun. Outside, the sun climbed higher, washing the lot in stark light. Eli glanced toward the horizon, where the town of Ashridge stretched out in uneasy quiet. Change was never easy, but it was always possible. And as he stood there, surrounded by the quiet weight of justice finally stepping into the light, Eli knew the real work was just beginning. In the days that followed, Eli Mercer's quiet stand at the Ashridge police station, a new rhythm settled over the town. It was subtle, like the first light of dawn that gently breaks through the darkness. The old silence that had weighed heavy in the station and across the community began to lift, replaced by the cautious murmur of accountability. Eli didn't seek fanfare. He didn't walk the streets as a hero or grant interviews to the press that began to circle Ashridge like curious birds sensing a shift in the air. Instead, he kept moving forward methodically and with purpose, as if each step was a quiet promise that the past wouldn't be forgotten and the future would be different. Inside the station walls, that once echoed with unspoken complicity, now heard the tapping of keyboards and the soft murmur of officers reviewing files, speaking in hushed but purposeful tones. Some, like Officer Mallory, a young woman who had quietly questioned the department's practices for years, found a voice she hadn't dared use before. She spoke to Grace Howard, shared what she knew, and in doing so, became part of the change Eli had been fighting for. Chief Walter Grady's office, once a place of avoidance and denial, stood empty. The nameplate on the door had been quietly removed, leaving only a faint outline where authority once sat unmoved. In its place, interim leadership focused not on preserving power, but on restoring integrity. Training sessions were scheduled, review boards formed, whispers of reform turned into commitments, and the officers who had once stood paralyzed in the face of truth found themselves reevaluating what it meant to serve and protect. Outside, Eli stood at the edge of the station's lot one crisp morning. The sky was painted in soft pinks and golds, the air carrying the scent of new beginnings. He held no badge in hand, no folder of accusations. He simply stood, watching the sunrise, a quiet sentinel to the change he had helped ignite. Behind him, Grace approached her steps, careful but confident. She stood beside him, her voice low. "They're listening now," she said. "It's not perfect, but it's a start." Eli nodded his gaze, never leaving the horizon. "It always starts like this, with listening, with truth." Grace glanced at him, her voice softening. "You did more than just tell the truth, Eli. You showed them how it's done." He finally turned to her, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We all have a role to play. Mine was just the beginning." As the sun rose higher, casting long golden rays across the station and the quiet town beyond, something unspoken settled between them. It wasn't just justice, it was redemption. For the community, for the officers, for the quiet, enduring truth that integrity always demands a voice, even when the world would rather stay silent. And with that, Eli Mercer walked away from the station, not into the shadows, but into the light of a new day, where redemption wasn't just a word, but a promise that would echo long after he was gone. In the end, Eli Mercer's story wasn't about a single act of defiance or the exposure of a corrupt system. It was a reflection of the deep resonant truth that dignity isn't granted, it's claimed often in the quietest, most resolute ways. What began as a routine traffic stop, a case of mistaken identity steeped in assumption and prejudice, unraveled into a revelation of systemic failure. Eli, an old veteran, knew this wasn't about a traffic violation. It was about a culture where respect was conditional, a culture where truth had long been silenced beneath layers of bureaucracy and indifference. When the officers dragged him into that cell, laughing at his silence, they didn't see a man with decades of integrity and honor. They didn't see a veteran who had served his country or an investigator who had dedicated his career to justice. They saw what they wanted to see, an elderly black man alone with no voice. But Eli's silence wasn't submission. It was patience, the gathering weight of a storm he knew would break in its own time. And when it did, when FBI agents filled that small station, when names and dates surfaced, when whispers turned into confessions, it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was measured steady and undeniable. This wasn't just Eli's victory. It was a reckoning for a town that had allowed shortcuts, assumptions, and prejudice to become routine. For every complaint that had been dismissed, for every voice silenced before it could be heard, Eli's quiet resolve became a mirror. The officers who had laughed and jeered at his quietness were left facing their own discomfort, their own complicity. Those who had stood by, unsure or afraid to speak, saw in Eli a blueprint for change, a reminder that strength often looks like calm in the face of provocation, like patience in the face of injustice. But the story didn't end there. It extended beyond the walls of that police station into the community of Ashridge and beyond. It reminded everyone who heard it that power isn't always held by those with loud voices or official titles. Sometimes it resides in the quiet dignity of someone who refuses to be broken by systems designed to minimize them. Eli didn't need to shout. He needed to stand. And in standing, he showed others how to do the same. The lesson from Eli's story is clear respect, and justice aren't gifts, they are demands. They require vigilance, the courage to question, and the humility to listen. In a world where it's often easier to look away or remain silent, Eli's story compels us to lean into discomfort, to challenge assumptions, and to create spaces where every voice matters. It teaches us that the quietest person in the room might just be the one with the deepest impact, and that true leadership doesn't need an announcement. It's shown in moments when no one is watching. For each of us, the takeaway is deeply personal. Whether you're facing injustice yourself, witnessing it happen to others, or grappling with the weight of silence, remember Eli Mercer's unwavering presence. Let it inspire you to speak when you must, to stand when it's hardest, and to listen when others finally find their voice. Change doesn't come in sweeping declarations. It comes in the quiet moments of recognition, in the steady resolve to do better, and in the collective decision to hold ourselves and each other accountable. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of the quiet power we all hold, take a moment to reflect, to share, and to carry this lesson forward. And if you haven't already hit that subscribe button to support this channel, by doing so, you'll not only stay connected to stories that challenge assumptions and inspire change, but you'll also help ensure that more voices, like Eli's, are heard loudly clearly, and in ways that make a real difference. Together, we can amplify the message that respect isn't a privilege, it's a right, and it starts with each of us.